What would you do if the only thing you had left in the world was the one thing no one wanted? If your inheritance, after a life of quiet loyalty, was a punchline whispered at your own father's wake? This is a story about a piece of land considered so worthless it was given away out of spite. A stretch of Arizona desert baked to the hardness of bone. But the truth waiting under that sun-scorched dust was a secret of water, memory, and immense value. A secret that would rewrite a family's history and forge a new future from grief. Settle in and stay close as we journey into the heart of the Sonoran Desert, where a dismissed daughter and a forgotten map are about to change everything. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight as we tell the story of Whitaker's folly. Lucy Whitaker stepped down from the stagecoach, and the heat of Tucson rose from the ground in a solid, shimmering wave. It was a physical blow, a final insult after a month of them. The dust, the color of rust and old blood, settled instantly on the hem of her black mourning dress, a garment that had been respectable and somber in the green humidity of the east. But here was just a woolen cage. She clutched the handle of the single trunk that held her entire world. A few changes of clothes, a small tin of her mother's hairpins, and her father's collection of maps. Old, cracked, and heavy with the smell of leather and ink, they were the source of her current predicament. Her father, a man who had dreamed more than he had acted, had poured his last years and last dollars into these parchments, charting and recharting a piece of land no one had ever cared about. In the end, it was all he'd had left to give her. The rest, the house, the savings, the small but respectable portfolio of stocks, had gone to her uncles and their smirking wives, men who had called her father a fool in life, and now profited from his death. The lawyer's office swam in her memory. The scent of stale cigar smoke, the drone of legal language, and the final dismissive clause. To my only daughter, Lucinda, I leave my parcel of land in the Arizona Territory, a place of profound potential. A soft, cruel titter had rippled through the room. Now, standing under the indifferent blue sky, that potential felt like a phantom. Her throat was tight with unshed tears and the fine, gritty dust of the road. She was 25 years old, alone, and the owner of nothing but a rectangle of dirt on a piece of paper. Her father's belief had to count for something. It had to. But as she looked down the long, unpaved street, past the false-fronted saloons and the weary faces of strangers, that belief felt as thin and fragile as a ghost. The weight of the trunk in her hand was the only solid thing in her world, a testament to a love that had left her stranded. The land office was a small, stuffy room that smelled of dry paper and sweat. The clerk, a man with a green visor that seemed permanently attached to his forehead, peered at her deed over the top of his spectacles. He tapped a long, ink-stained finger on the parchment. Section 22, Township 14 South, Range 16 East, he recited, his voice devoid of interest. Yes, ma'am. We have it on the territorial survey. Belongs to the late Mr. Thomas Whitaker. He didn't look up. Taxes are due in 2 months. After that, it reverts to the territory for auction. His tone suggested this was an inevitability, a simple matter of paperwork completing its cycle. Lucy's heart sank. 2 months. Is there any interest in it? From neighbors, ranchers, she asked, her voice smaller than she'd intended. The clerk gave a dry, rustling chuckle. Ma'am, with respect, it's what we call scorched land. No water, no grazing, too rocky for crops. The Bar T Ranch borders it to the north, but Mr. Calloway has all the water he needs. He wouldn't want more dust. Just then, the door swung open, letting in a blinding slice of sunlight and a large, florid man. Uncle Marcus. He had come west on the railroad, a week ahead of her, to oversee the family's interests, which meant ensuring she didn't somehow turn her worthless inheritance into a problem for him. "Lucinda, there you are," he boomed, his voice filling the small space. "Still chasing this wild goose of your father's?" He glanced at the clerk, a knowing smirk on his face. "This is my niece, inherited Whitaker's folly. My brother, bless his soul, was a fine man but a terrible judge of dirt." The clerk offered a non-committal grunt, but Lucy saw the flicker of shared amusement in his eyes. Across the room, a man stood looking at a large territorial map tacked to the wall. He was tall and lean, dressed in practical, sun-faded canvas, his face weathered into a quiet stillness. He didn't turn, but Lucy felt his silence as a counterpoint to her uncle's bluster. He seemed rooted to the floor, a part of the landscape itself. Marcus clapped her on the shoulder. "Sell it for the taxes, girl. Take the $50 and come stay with your aunt. There's no shame in admitting defeat." Defeat. The word hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She looked from her uncle's condescending face to the deed in her hand, her father's elegant, hopeful signature at the bottom. She couldn't. Not yet. She had to see it first. She had to stand on the ground he had believed in. What would you do? Would you listen to the laughter and walk away, or would you walk toward the silence and the dust? What secret could a piece of worthless land possibly hold? Let us know what you think in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history and quiet courage. Now, Lucy had to find someone who could read the land, not just the ledger. The whispers followed Lucy Whitaker from the general store to the livery. She was the Eastern girl with the morning dress and the worthless deed, a walking piece of town gossip. "That's Thomas Whitaker's girl," she heard a woman murmur over a barrel of pinto beans. "Poor thing. He filled her head with stories of silver and lost Spanish missions." A man leaning against a post spit a stream of tobacco juice near her boots. "More like lost his mind," he muttered to his friend. "Paid good money for a patch of hell." Each comment was a small stone thrown at the fragile wall of her resolve. Her Uncle Marcus held court in the hotel saloon, buying rounds of whiskey and telling exaggerated tales of his brother's eccentricities. He painted a picture of a man lost in fantasy, a cautionary tale for any who would choose dreams over dollars. Lucy heard the stories relayed back to her, twisted and embellished, until her father sounded like a madman and she, his deluded disciple. She learned to keep her eyes down, her expression neutral, her purpose held close like a secret. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive judgment of the town, she walked to the edge of the settlement where the adobes gave way to the open desert. An old woman sat under the shade of a mesquite tree, a blanket displaying her hand-formed pottery. Her face was a beautiful map of wrinkles, her dark eyes holding a deep, settled calm. She was Pasquala, a Tohono O'odham elder who had seen decades of newcomers arrive with their loud ambitions and louder disappointments. Lucy stopped, drawn by the woman's silence. She ran a hand over a cool, smooth pot, its surface decorated with geometric patterns that seemed to speak of the earth itself. Pasquala didn't try to sell her anything. She simply watched. After a long moment, the old woman's gaze shifted from the pot to Lucy's hands, which were soft and pale, unused to the harshness of this new world. Then, her eyes lifted, looking past Lucy toward the distant, heat-shimmered mountains that bordered the very land Lucy now owned. Her voice, when it came, was low and raspy, like stones rubbing together. La tierra más seca, she said, her English slow and deliberate. Recuerda el agua más profunda. The driest ground remembers the deepest water. Lucy stared at her, confused. It sounded like a proverb, a piece of desert poetry with no practical meaning. She thanked the woman, paid for a small, unadorned cup, and walked away, the cryptic words echoing in her mind. It was a warning, a blessing, a riddle. She couldn't tell which. All she knew was that it was the first thing anyone had said to her that didn't feel like mockery or pity. It felt like a key, though she had no idea what lock it might fit. The journey to Section 22 was a slow, grinding ordeal. Lucy spent the last of her traveling money on a sway-backed mule named Cicero and a rickety buckboard wagon that threatened to fall apart with every jolt. The man at the livery had given her a pitying look, but took her money all the same. She loaded her trunk, a barrel of water, and a sack of provisions, flour, beans, salted pork, and set out alone at dawn. The town vanished behind her in a haze of dust, and the world opened up into a vast, silent expanse of creosote, saguaro, and stone. The sun climbed, relentless and white. The heat pressed down, stealing the moisture from her skin and the hope from her heart. Cicero plodded onward, his ears drooping, his pace a funereal march that mirrored her own spirits. This was the land her father had loved, had written about in his letters with such passion. He'd described the colors of the sunset, the stark beauty of the landscape, the feeling of ancientness. But all Lucy could feel was a profound and hostile emptiness. It was a land that did not want her. It did not want anything. It simply endured. By late afternoon, following the crude map the land clerk had drawn for her, she reached the marker stake that designated the northeast corner of her property. She climbed down from the wagon, her legs stiff, her body aching. And she looked. It was worse than she had imagined. Worse than the clerk's dismissal. Worse than her uncle's scorn. It was a slope of pale, gravelly soil, studded with jagged rocks and thorny bushes. Not a tree for shade. Not a blade of grass for grazing. Just a tilted, barren plate under a punishing sky. A wave of despair, so powerful it made her dizzy, washed over her. They were right. Everyone was right. Her father had been a fool, and she was a bigger one for following his delusion all the way here. Tears she had refused to shed in the lawyer's office or in the dusty town now burned hot on her cheeks. She sank to the ground, the rough fabric of her dress catching on thorns, and let out a single, ragged sob. The sound was immediately swallowed by the immense silence. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, she forced herself to move. She unhitched Cicero, giving him water from her precious supply. She built a small fire from dry creosote branches, the smoke rising thin and lonely into the vast, darkening sky. She ate a joyless meal of hardtack and beans. Laying out her bedroll near the dying embers, she stared up at a spray of stars so bright and cold they seemed to mock her smallness. She was an intruder here, a tiny, grieving speck in a world of profound indifference. She fell into a fitful sleep, the deed to this wasteland tucked inside her bodice like a stone against her heart. The next morning, the world was remade in the cool, clean light of dawn. The despair of the previous night had receded with the darkness, leaving behind a quiet, stubborn resolve. She would not be defeated by a single night. She owed her father more than that. After a meager breakfast, she retrieved the heavy, leather-bound tube from her trunk. It contained his master maps, the ones he had worked on for years. She unrolled the largest one on the flat surface of a rock, weighting its corners with smaller stones. It was a beautiful piece of work, drawn with a draftsman's precision and an artist's care. The elevation lines were delicate and sure, the geological notations neat and clear. But as she studied it, comparing the ink on the page to the land before her, she noticed something odd. In the northwest quadrant, near a distinctive outcropping of dark volcanic rock that she could see from her campsite, was a small, strange symbol. It wasn't a standard surveyor's mark for a spring, a mine, or a boundary. It was a small, tightly coiled spiral, like a serpent asleep, with a tiny arrow pointing from its center toward the rock formation. Her first thought was that it was a mistake, a slip of his pen, a meaningless doodle. She traced it with her finger. It felt deliberate. She pulled out another, older map from the tube, a preliminary sketch. The spiral was there too, but fainter, more questioning. On a third, a geological survey, the area around the spiral was annotated with a single cryptic word: sonido, sound. She didn't understand. The land before her was the quietest place she had ever been. There was no sound, but the whisper of the wind and the buzz of a fly. She walked over to the outcropping, the sun already beginning to bake the ground. The rocks were black and sharp, a stark contrast to the pale soil around them. She kicked at the base with the toe of her boot. Solid. She knocked on one of the larger boulders with her knuckles. A dull, solid thud. Nothing. It was nothing. Just another of her father's fancies, a product of a mind that saw patterns where none existed. She felt a familiar pang of disappointment, a mix of love and frustration for the man who had bequeathed her this puzzle. She walked back to her camp, trying to dismiss it, to focus on the practical matter of how she could possibly make this land presentable enough to sell for the price of its taxes. But the image of the coiled serpent stayed in her mind's eye, a question mark drawn in ink on a landscape of brutal, unyielding answers. It was the first detail that didn't quite fit the narrative of worthlessness, a single dissonant note in a chorus of despair. Lucy knew she couldn't sell the land, or even understand it, without a proper survey. A formal plat map, registered and stamped, was the only language men like the land clerk and her uncle understood. There was only one surveyor she had seen whose quiet demeanor suggested competence over bluster. The man from the land office. She found him at the livery, mending a leather strap on his saddlebags. His name was Robert Hale. When she approached, he looked up, his eyes a clear, steady gray. He remembered her from the office. "Ma'am," he said, his voice quiet and even. She explained what she needed. A full survey of Section 22, every corner marked, every feature noted, no matter how insignificant. He listened patiently, his gaze never leaving her face. When she finished, he hesitated. "Miss Whitaker," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I'll be frank. A survey like that costs money. More than that land is likely to fetch you. It's not a good investment." It was the same logic everyone else used, but in his mouth, it sounded like honest counsel, not scorn. "I'm not asking for an investment," Lucy replied, her chin lifting slightly. "I'm asking for a measurement. My father believed there was more to this land than meets the eye. I need to know if he was right." Something in her tone, the exhaustion, the defiance, the grief, seemed to break through his professional reserve. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right, Miss Whitaker. I'll do it." They started the next day. Robert arrived at her camp just after sunrise, his own mule laden with the tools of his trade. A heavy transit, a tripod, measuring chains, and marking stakes. The work was slow and punishing. Lucy insisted on helping, dragging the heavy Gunter's chain through the thorny scrub, holding the stadia rod steady while he squinted through the eyepiece of his transit, her hands quickly becoming blistered and raw. They worked mostly in silence, a comfortable quiet that grew between them under the vast sky. Robert was a man of few words but precise actions. He moved with an economy of motion, his respect for his tools and his craft evident in every gesture. He was a widower, she learned in a brief exchange, his wife taken by fever 2 years prior. He spoke of it simply, a fact stated without sentimentality. Yet the loss was there in the settled quiet of his eyes. As they worked their way toward the northwest quadrant, toward the black rock outcropping, Lucy's sense of anticipation grew. She said nothing of her father's map or the strange symbol. She wanted to see what Robert's instruments would reveal on their own. As he drove a wooden stake into the ground about 20 yards from the formation, the sound was different. Not the solid thump of stake into earth, but a hollow, resonant thunk. Robert paused, the mallet still in his hand. He frowned, then struck the ground again in a different spot a few feet away. Thump. He moved back to the first spot. Thunk. That's odd, he murmured, more to himself than to her. He knelt, brushing away the gravelly soil and tapping the ground with his knuckles. It was faint, but unmistakable. A hollowness, a space beneath the surface. He looked from the ground to the rock outcropping, then back again, a question forming on his face. He glanced at Lucy and saw in her eyes not surprise but confirmation. He realized then that she had been leading him here, that this was not a random survey but a search. The labor had brought them to the clue. The discovery of the hollow sound changed the tenor of their work from a methodical survey to a focused investigation. That evening, by the light of a flickering campfire, Lucy finally showed Robert her father's map. She pointed to the coiled serpent symbol and the word sonido. Robert traced the drawing with a calloused finger, his expression thoughtful. "Your father wasn't just mapping the surface," he said softly. He was listening to it. He understood. He didn't dismiss it as fantasy. He saw it as data, another form of measurement. The next morning, they set aside the transit and chains and picked up a shovel and a pry bar. They began at the base of the rock outcropping, tapping and listening, following the hollow sound as it led them toward a section of the formation that looked like a jumble of fallen boulders. One stone, larger than the rest, seemed out of place. It was weathered, but not in the same way as the others. The edges were slightly less sharp, as if it had been moved. It took both of them, straining with the pry bar, to shift it. With a deep groan of rock on rock, the boulder moved, revealing a dark, narrow opening behind it, just large enough for a person to squeeze through. A gust of cool, musty air breathed out from the blackness. It was a cave, or the entrance to one. Robert lit a lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows. He went in first, Lucy close behind him. The space was small, a natural rock chamber no larger than a pantry, and in the center of the dusty floor sat a heavy, iron-strapped strongbox, the kind used by the cavalry or stage lines. It was rusted, but intact. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was the heart of the secret. They carried it out into the daylight. The lock was corroded shut. Robert used the end of the pry bar, and with a screech of tortured metal, the lid sprang open. Lucy leaned forward, her breath held tight in her chest. Inside, resting on a bed of what looked like dried leaves, was a thick, leather-bound journal, a small, heavy pouch made of buckskin, and a stack of carefully folded papers. She lifted the journal first. The handwriting on the first page was her father's. "My dearest Lucy," it began, "if you are reading this, I have gone, but my work remains. Do not believe what they say of this land." She opened the buckskin pouch. It was filled with gold coins, double eagles mostly, enough to pay the back taxes a dozen times over. Then she unfolded the papers. They were maps, but far more detailed than the ones she had. One showed the path of an underground aquifer, a water source deep beneath the property, with a notation marking the spot where it ran closest to the surface. Another charted a forgotten trail, a pre-railroad wagon cutoff that ran directly through their section, a direct route between Tucson and the mining camps to the north. It would be invaluable for freight. The final page was a letter from a geologist confirming the likelihood of a stable water table. Her father hadn't been a fool. He had been a scientist, a historian, a visionary. He hadn't bought a piece of worthless desert. He had bought a crossroads. He had bought water. In the driest country imaginable, he had bought life itself. The tears that came this time were not of grief or despair, but of a profound, overwhelming vindication. The discovery left them in a state of stunned silence, the weight of its implications settling over the small camp. They had water, a trade route, and capital. They had a future. But the desert, as if to remind them of its power, was not finished with its own tests. By mid-afternoon, the sky to the west began to change color, shifting from a clear, hard blue to a bruised, yellowish-brown. The air grew still and heavy, charged with an electric tension. "Dust storm," Robert said, his voice grim as he scanned the horizon. "A bad one. We need to get under cover." The wind picked up in an instant, hot and abrasive, whipping sand into their faces. The approaching wall of dust was immense, a churning, tumbling monster that blotted out the sun and turned the day to a terrifying twilight. There was no time to pack the camp or secure the wagon. "The cave!" Lucy shouted over the rising shriek of the wind. They scrambled for the small opening behind the rock, pulling the heavy strongbox and their water canteens in with them, just as the full force of the storm hit. The world outside dissolved into a roaring, blinding chaos of sand and wind. Inside the small chamber, it was dark and cramped, the air thick with the smell of ancient dust. The lantern cast dancing shadows on the rock walls as the storm raged, the sound a deafening howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. They were trapped, but safe. Hours passed. The storm showed no sign of abating. Sometime in the deepest part of the tempest, they heard a new sound, a desperate human cry, nearly lost in the wind's fury. Robert and Lucy exchanged a look of alarm. He tied a rope around his waist, handing the other end to Lucy. "Hold this. Don't let go," he ordered. "I'm going to look." Bracing himself against the gale, he edged out of the cave, disappearing into the brown maelstrom. Lucy held the rope with all her strength, her knuckles white, her heart pounding with fear. Minutes felt like an eternity. Then, a tug on the rope. She pulled, and Robert stumbled back into the opening, half carrying, half dragging a man, a woman, and a small, terrified child. They were a family, their wagon shattered by the wind, their horse lost to the storm. Their faces were caked with mud and tears, their eyes wide with shock. Lucy didn't hesitate. She gave them water, shared the last of her bread, and wrapped the shivering child in her own bedroll. Huddled together in the tiny, lantern-lit cave, 5 people waited out the storm, strangers bound by a shared moment of crisis and a simple act of shelter. Lucy looked at the grateful faces of the family, at Robert's steady presence beside her, and understood something profound. This land had asked for more than just her belief. It had asked for her stewardship. In offering sanctuary, she had laid the first true stone of her new home. When the wind finally died and the sun broke through, the world was scoured clean, covered in a fresh blanket of fine red dust. The air was cool and washed. The family, whose name was Clark, was overwhelmed with gratitude. Their wagon was a wreck, but they were alive. "We'd have been lost, mister," Clark said, his voice thick with emotion, shaking Robert's hand. "Buried. We owe you our lives." Lucy assured them it was nothing, but she knew it was everything. As Robert helped Mr. Clark rig a crude travois to carry their belongings back to town, Mrs. Clark pressed the small pottery cup Lucy had bought from Pasquale back into her hands. "You keep this," she said, "to remember that even in the worst of it, there's kindness." The Clark story spread through Tucson before they had even finished their first meal at the hotel. They spoke of the sudden, violent storm, their near-death experience, and the quiet woman and the surveyor who had pulled them from the jaws of the tempest. They spoke of a cave, of shelter, and of a generosity that asked for nothing in return. The whispers about Lucy Whitaker began to change. The deluded Eastern girl became the brave woman from Section 22. The story of her inheriting Whitaker's folly was now told with a note of curiosity, not scorn. A week later, guided by the detailed map from her father's journal, Lucy and Robert found the spot. It was a shallow basin, barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. But when Robert drove a steel rod into the ground, it sank easily, and when he pulled it out, the tip was wet. They had found the water. The news of the spring, confirmed by the land clerk who came out himself, was a seismic event. Water was the currency of the territory, more valuable than gold. Suddenly, Section 22 was no longer the middle of nowhere. It was the key to the entire region. Freight wagons, ranchers, and the railroad all needed reliable water. Her father's forgotten cut-off trail was now a vital artery. Her Uncle Marcus appeared at her camp one evening, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. He stared at the well-digging equipment Robert had hired, at the fresh survey stakes marking out a town site. I don't understand," he stammered. "Thomas never said—" "He tried to tell you," Lucy said, her voice even and calm, without triumph or malice. "You just weren't listening." Marcus looked at his niece, at the confident set of her shoulders and the sun-browned strength in her face. He saw not the foolish girl he had pitied, but the inheritor of a wisdom he had been too arrogant to recognize. He turned and left without another word, humbled not by her wealth, but by her father's enduring vision. The town no longer laughed. It watched in reverent silence as Whitaker's folly began to bloom. The seasons turned. The raw wound of the well they had dug became a proper stone-lined structure, cool and deep. A small adobe house, built with the help of Robert and men from town, now stood where Lucy's lonely campfire had once burned. The walls were thick, the rooms cool, and from her porch she could see the steady trickle of commerce beginning to trace the old wagon cutoff, a dusty ribbon of life unfurling across her land. The Bar T Ranch now paid her for watering rights, and the freight company that ran supplies to the northern mines had a contract to use the trail and the spring. The town that was growing around the well was small, just a few sturdy buildings so far, but it was real. It had a name: Agua Recuerdo, remembered water. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in the brilliant colors her father had so loved, Lucy stood with Robert on the small ridge overlooking their valley. The heat of the day was giving way to a gentle, fragrant coolness. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with the promise of cicadas and the distant, comfortable sounds of settlement. Robert stood beside her, his presence as solid and reassuring as the land itself. Their partnership, forged in labor and crisis, had deepened into a quiet, unspoken affection. He was a part of this place now, a part of her life. He gestured with his chin toward the growing settlement, the warm lights beginning to glow in the windows. "Your father would be proud," he said. "You've built something here." Lucy looked out at the land, at the dark, volcanic rocks that guarded the cave, at the line of green that was beginning to trace the path of the water, at the sturdy little house that was her home. She thought of the mockery, the grief, and the long, lonely journey that had brought her here. She had come seeking to sell a piece of her past, to rid herself of a burden. Instead, she had found its deepest meaning. "It was never about building something new," she said softly, the words carrying the entire weight of her story. "It was about proving what was already here." She had not created the water or the trail. She had simply listened, as her father had, to the memory of the land. Thank you for staying with us for this story of quiet determination and the surprising power of what lies hidden beneath the surface. If you were moved by Lucy's journey to prove that what the world dismisses often contains what the world most needs, please leave a like and a comment below. Be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next story from the forgotten corners of history. Until then, take care.